By the time Margaret Kelly's vision blurred at the servant's stare, the morning had already informed her, in 3 different voices, of her precise market value. "Too plain," said her stepmother's dresser with sympathetic relish, while pinning ribbons into Miss Louisa Kelly's hair. "Too quiet," said Lady Kelly herself, as if stillness were a kind of insolence. "Too expensive to keep," said the steward, reading from Lady Kelly's list of economies, where Margaret's name appeared between lamp oil and sugared almonds. Margaret paused on the narrow landing, one hand on the rough rail, and waited for the black motes in her sight to clear. She had been awake since before dawn, balancing account books in the breakfast room while the fire was laid, then carrying correspondence to Lady Kelly's writing table, then sorting invitation cards by rank and profit. Profit was Lady Kelly's true measure of every person in the house, and Margaret had long ceased pretending she might one day be exempt. At 22 she was dark-haired, long-faced, and built for endurance rather than admiration. People called her solemn. Crueler people called her cow-eyed. Margaret suspected artists, had she ever had the leisure to sit for one, would have called her arresting and gone on painting anyway. But she was not painted. She was used. Once, before her father died, she had expected little more from life than books, ink-stained fingers, and the warm, practical affection of a man who taught her to read ledgers as fluently as novels. Mr. Kelly had believed numbers were stories in stricter clothing. "Look for what repeats," he used to tell her, tapping a column with his pen. "Repetition is either honesty or theft." After fever carried him off in one wet November, Lady Kelly inherited his income, his daughter, and none of his principles. Margaret became, overnight, an inconvenient attachment from the first marriage, not poor enough to dismiss publicly, not connected enough to place advantageously, and too educated to be trusted without supervision. She had been brought to the Duke of Brackenmere's London residence under the useful pretence of family intimacy, though no one could have mistaken her position. She sat below salt at dinner when dinners occurred, copied lists when guests were expected, and vanished when company arrived. Brackenmere House itself seemed to hold its breath. Tall windows looked over a wet square where carriage wheels hissed through grime. Inside, long corridors muffled voices and swallowed footsteps. The servants moved as if through a church where someone had recently died and not yet been buried. In truth, no one had died. That possibility was what made everyone whisper. For 9 days the Duke had locked himself in his private chambers and refused food. The first day had been treated as a mood, the third as exhaustion. By the 5th, 2 physicians had come and gone with offended faces and untouched drafts. By the 7th, footmen stopped making wages and started crossing themselves. On the 9th morning, even Lady Kelly lowered her voice when she spoke his name, though not from tenderness. "His Grace is overtaxed," she told callers. "He has suffered a melancholy indisposition." To the staff she said, "He is to be obeyed and managed." To Margaret she said, "If this house collapses, do not imagine you will be carried clear of the rubble." Margaret knew little of the Duke except what any observant shadow might know. He was 34, broad-shouldered before recent grief narrowed him, and given to an economy of speech that made flatterers nervous and honest men briefly brave. He had inherited land enough to ruin lesser people merely by neglecting it, but was said to inspect his accounts himself and remember tenant names. In London he was considered severe, inconveniently principled, and difficult to trap into polite falsehoods. Lady Kelly alternated between praising his discernment and calling him impossible, depending on who listened. Something had happened 9 days ago. No one would say what in plain terms, but whispers drifted through the house like smoke. Papers signed in haste, cottages cleared, Children turned out, men kneeling in mud at estate gates. Margaret heard enough fragments to know there were families attached to those fragments, and enough silence to know fear had nested in every room. At noon, she was sent with a luncheon tray to the upper corridor and instructed to leave it outside the Duke's door. The tray returned at 3, untouched. At 6, the same. At 8, broth gone cold, beside white fish, gone stiff, untouched. In the still hour before dinner, Lady Kelly held court in the blue drawing-room, where candles made her jewels glow and softened the sharpness of her mouth. Louisa sat nearby, practising a smile in the reflection of a silver urn, preparing for assemblies that might restore the family's social momentum. Margaret stood at the escritoire, copying addresses with unblotted precision. "Your hand is useful," Lady Kelly said, without looking up. "If only your face were." Louisa laughed, then seemed unsure if she should, and let the sound die. Margaret kept writing. "Do not sulk," Lady Kelly went on. "I merely state facts. You have no dowry worth mention, no particular beauty, and the unfortunate habit of looking as though you are listening when gentlemen speak. Men dislike that in women without fortune. You must make yourself cheap in order to remain employable." The pen paused only once. "And yet," Lady Kelly added, "you consume food, fabric, and space. We must justify each expense, must we not?" "Yes, ma'am," Margaret said. That was her chief skill in Lady Kelly's eyes. Consent without expression. When at last she was dismissed, hunger sat inside her like a folded knife. She had missed breakfast and taken only tea at noon. In the kitchen passage she considered asking cook for a crust and thought better of it. Lady Kelly had lately begun calling such requests pilfering. Margaret climbed toward the nursery attic where she slept, counting steps to keep from counting worries. On the landing outside the upper corridor she stopped. Ahead, at the very end, stood the Duke's locked door, oak dark as old blood, brass bolt turned from within. Beside it, on a side table, another silver tray waited under a domed cover, steam no longer rising. She was still looking at it when Jenkins, the head footman, approached with his shoulders set too high. "Miss Kelly," he murmured, "her ladyship asks you below. At once." Lady Kelly was waiting in the small morning room with the curtains drawn against the dusk. She did not ask Margaret to sit. "You will take this tray to his Grace now," she said. "I took one at noon, ma'am, and at 6. "Then you are experienced in failure." Lady Kelly's smile was thin enough to cut. "Listen well. If the Duke dies in that room, this household will devour itself. There will be inquiry, scandal, lawsuits, creditors, carrion journalists. People will demand to know who attended him, who neglected him, who stood nearest the door while he declined." Margaret held her gaze. "You stand nearest," Lady Kelly said softly. "You are the convenient relation, the extra mouth, the inauspicious burden no one asked to keep. If his Grace dies, you will be out before dawn with one valise and no references. Do you understand?" The room seemed suddenly airless. Margaret thought of her father's books boxed in the attic, of his name in parish records, of winter streets and lodging houses where women without protection vanished into rumour. "Yes, ma'am," she said again, though this time the words tasted of iron. "Good, take the tray, knock, beg, weep if you can manage it, be useful for once." Margaret took the tray because there was no choice offered, and because her hands, her treacherously steady hands, could hold what her chest could not. On her way up, she passed through the kitchen passage where cook and 2 maids stood pretending not to listen for footsteps overhead. The room smelled of yeast and bone broth. On the corner of the work table lay the day's last coarse loaf, split and drying at one end. Without pausing to think, Margaret tore off a heel, wrapped it in a clean strip of linen, and slipped it beneath the folded napkin beside the silver plate. Not theft, she told herself grimly. Triage. At the top corridor, the lamps had been lowered. Rain tapped the shutters. She set the polished tray before the Duke's door, then stood very still, listening. Nothing. No pacing, no cough, no voice refusing entry. Only a dense, suffocating silence that made the hair rise along her arms. She knelt, drew the heel of bread from beneath the napkin, and placed it apart from the untouched luxury of fish and sauce. Bread was what a man might eat without ceremony, without admitting appetite, without consenting to be ministered to. Bread was ordinary enough to forgive. She had no right to write to him, which meant perhaps she was the only one who still might. From her pocket she took a scrap torn from an old household circular and a pencil worn short from accounts. In her neat, upright hand she wrote, "A man may atone while living, but never while dead." She folded the note once, set it against the bread, and rose. Her knees had gone weak. For one absurd moment she considered knocking. Instead she did the harder thing and walked away. Sleep did not come. She lay beneath the sloped roof, hearing rain and distant doors, and once, near midnight, footsteps crossing the upper corridor too light for a footman. At dawn she dressed and went down before the bell. The silver luncheon tray still sat outside the Duke's door when she reached the landing, cloche tarnished by night air, broth congealed. Her pulse dropped. Then she saw it. The linen lay unfolded. The heel of bread was gone, and as she watched, scarcely breathing, the bolt inside the door slid back with a dry metallic click. Word travelled through Brackenmere House faster than fire in old drapery. By breakfast, maids whispered in pantry corners. By 10, one physician had been recalled and then dismissed from the hall because His Grace will receive no one. At 11, the Duke appeared at the top of the main staircase, one hand on the banister, as if he had forgotten briefly what his body weighed. He looked as if the 9 days had carved him from stone and left only edges. His cheekbones were stark, his mouth hard with private fury, his eyes hollowed but violently awake. Everyone in the hall bowed too low and too long. Lady Kelly, in dove-grey silk, swept forward with maternal concern arranged upon her face. "Your Grace," she breathed, "what relief to see you restored." "Who wrote it?" he said. His voice was roughened but unmistakably controlled. He did not look at her. Lady Kelly blinked. "Wrote the note left at my door." His gaze moved over the assembled servants, one by one, not unkindly, but with a precision that made people drop their eyes. "Who wrote, 'A man may atone while living, but never while dead'?" A silence opened. Margaret stood near the back, by the morning-room arch, a stack of copied circulars in her arms. She felt, absurdly, as if the whole house had become one large ear. Lady Kelly recovered first. "I sent several messages in my concern," she said smoothly. "If one proved persuasive, I am grateful." The Duke turned his head, slow as a gun carriage. "You wrote it?" "Perhaps not in those exact words. One says so much in crisis." She gave a soft laugh meant to suggest sleepless devotion. "Surely the sentiment, not the penmanship, not you," he said. Colour rose, then drained from her face. "If some servant presumed—" "No one in my household presumes to speak to me as if I can still choose." The words landed heavy in the hall. This did. Margaret wished with sudden fervour for invisibility. Instead, she felt Lady Kelly's attention find her, like a pin through cloth. "Margaret carries trays," Lady Kelly said lightly. "She is dutiful, if unimaginative. I cannot answer for what notions she picks up in kitchens." Several heads turned. Margaret kept her eyes on the papers in her arms. The Duke followed those glances and stopped on her. For a heartbeat she thought he would summon her before everyone. Instead, his expression shuttered. "Whoever wrote it," he said to the room at large, "will present themselves to my secretary by evening. I do not reward cowardice." Then he turned, not waiting for Lady Kelly's reply, and crossed into his study with a stride that still betrayed weakness. Only when the door closed did sound return. Breath, silk, a dropped spoon somewhere distant. Lady Kelly smiled at those nearest with all the warmth of polished marble. "His Grace is unwell," she said. "We shall all be discreet." By noon, discreet had become malicious. In the scullery, Margaret heard that she had slipped love letters under the Duke's door. In the laundry passage, she learned she meant to secure a title by tears. By afternoon, according to the coachman, she had bewitched him with scripture. Margaret did not defend herself. Denial fed gossip better than confession. Lady Kelly waited until evening to strike privately. She summoned Margaret to her dressing-room, where perfumes warred with lamp smoke, and closed the door with deliberate care. "You have been industrious," she said. "One crust and one line of copied piety, and suddenly you are discussed on every staircase." "I left bread because he had eaten nothing," Margaret said. "How saintly." Lady Kelly sat before her mirror, removing an earring as if discussing weather. "You will tell His Grace, if asked, that I instructed you to leave encouragement of every kind. You will not embellish. You will not mention this morning's little theatre." Margaret said nothing. Lady Kelly met her eyes in the mirror. "Do you imagine he can protect you? Men notice what flatters their pain and forget what does not. When this season turns, you will remain what you are, dependent on my goodwill." She stood, crossed the room, and lowered her voice. "I also wonder how certain records might read if revisited. Your father, for instance, held responsibilities before his death. Accounts pass through many hands. Errors occur. Debts attach to names. Reputations can be revised with very little ink." The threat was almost elegant in its cruelty. Margaret felt it like cold water down her spine. "My father kept exact books," she said quietly. Lady Kelly's smile returned. "Then you have nothing to fear if you are obedient." When Margaret left, her hands shook for the first time all day. She went to the small office where she had been ordered to copy materials for Lady Kelly's charitable committee, subscription lists, donation receipts, correspondence to parish stewards, and sat until the shaking eased. Under the top sheaf of harmless circulars lay another packet tied with blue ribbon. Tenant notices, legal drafts, eviction orders bearing the Duke's seal in a hand that looked right until one examined the pressure of the pen. Repetition is either honesty or theft. Margaret untied the ribbon. If she spoke, Lady Kelly could ruin the one thing she had left of her father, his name. If she stayed silent, families already turned out might never return, and more could follow. If the Duke relapsed into grief or rage, there would be no one between Lady Kelly and the estates but men she already paid. Upstairs, somewhere beyond two locked doors, a man who had nearly starved himself back into childhood was swallowing broth by the spoonful, and trying, perhaps, to become dangerous to his enemies again. Margaret smoothed the first page, set clean paper beside it, and began to copy every line. The scratch of her pen sounded indecently loud in the little office. Outside, Brackenmere House settled into its night noises. Distant doors, the thud of coal, a muffled laugh cut short. Here there was only ink, ribbon, and theft dressed as administration. The first notice was ordinary enough at a glance. Arrears, warning, formal language she had copied 100 times for men who paid late and women who paid in eggs. The second repeated the same names with different dates. The third bore the Duke's seal and a command for immediate clearance of 2 cottages on Brackenmere East. His signature sat beneath it, beautifully formed and wrong. The loops were perfect. The pressure was not. Whoever had forged it had practised shape and forgotten weight. Repetition is either honesty or theft. By the 4th page, Margaret no longer doubted which one she was looking at. She copied until the candle guttered, shook ash from the nib, and copied again. Where she found dates, she marked dates. Where she found initials in the margin, J.S., R.B., once a hurried L.K., she copied those too. A draft letter mentioned distressed parcels suitable to private acquisition, once removals are complete. Another referred to our solicitor and quiet settlement of Kelly obligations, which made her stop breathing for a full count of 3 before forcing herself on. At last, she stacked her pages, blotted them, and retied the original packet exactly as she had found it. The copy she folded into the lining of an old account ledger and carried up to the nursery attic beneath her shawl like contraband. Sleep came in strips and jolts. At dawn she was back in the breakfast room with her hair pinned plain and her face arranged blank. By 10 Jenkins had announced that His Grace had taken broth. At 11 the Duke's secretary sent for ledgers from the estate cupboard. By noon the hall knew he had asked for black tea and dry toast, with no one present but Jenkins. "He bit the cook's head off for adding butter," one maid whispered in the kitchen passage, half scandalised, half relieved. "If he can scold, he means to stay alive." Margaret said nothing and carried a tray of correspondence to the blue drawing-room, where Lady Kelly received visitors in lavender silk and sorrow. "So trying," Lady Kelly was saying to Mrs. Penrith from Hanover Square. "His Grace has always felt too deeply. One fears for men of sensibility in these times." When Margaret entered, Lady Kelly did not break rhythm. "Set those there, child. No, not that pile. The other one, the one marked for parish committees." The cards in that pile were not charity at all. They were communications to stewards, agents, and one London solicitor, whose name Margaret now knew by repeated sight, Mr. Silas Brent. The same name appeared in 3 eviction orders and 2 debt schedules. She moved to leave. Lady Kelly's voice stopped her. "You have not yet reported to His Grace's secretary, I think." "No, ma'am." "Then do so by evening. We should not appear disobedient." The smile she offered in front of company was gentle enough to pass for kindness. Her eyes were a warning. Margaret curtsied and withdrew, pulse knocking at her throat. If she went to the secretary and admitted the note, she stepped into the Duke's notice and Lady Kelly's retaliation. If she lied, and the lie was discovered, she would be finished from both directions. There was no safe corridor left in the house. In the lower hall she nearly collided with Louisa, who smelled of violets and impatience. "You look ghastly," Louisa observed. "Mother says you always do when you are plotting." "I am carrying letters." "That is what plotting looks like on your face." Louisa tilted her head. "Is it true you made His Grace eat with a sermon scribbled on scrap? Jenkins says men admire severity if the woman is plain enough to seem virtuous." Margaret adjusted the letters in her arms. "Jenkins says many things," Louisa laughed. "Take care, Margaret. Mother is in no mood to be crossed, and if you fancy yourself romantic, remember dukes do not marry pity." She swept off before Margaret could answer, skirts whispering over the tiles. By afternoon, rain had returned, and with it a closed carriage at the side entrance. Jenkins, dry as ceremony, took a gentleman's coat and announced, "Mr. Brent for Lady Kelly." Margaret, sent through the passage with account books, slowed near the half-open morning-room door. She heard Lady Kelly's lower register, the one she used for hard bargaining. Must be complete before quarter sessions, she was saying. If petitions are filed first, we lose leverage. Mr. Brent replied in a voice like paper rubbed together. Then His Grace must continue to be indisposed. A pause. He is eating, Lady Kelly said. That was not expected. Then we proceed with the executed orders already in hand. Signatures stand unless challenged with originals. And if originals are requested, leave that to me. Margaret moved before the floorboard under her betrayed her. In the scullery she stood over a basin she did not remember filling and scrubbed clean plates that were already clean until cook touched her elbow and said very softly, Miss, you'll wear the glaze off. At 6 she carried tea to the secretary's room and found it empty but for ledgers spread in disciplined piles. On the corner lay a slip in a clerk's hand, Miss Kelly to attend upon Mr. Harland at 8. At 8 Mr. Harland was present, thin and severe, with ink on his cuffs and no time for niceties. Miss Kelly, he said, not looking up from the register he was annotating. His Grace requested the author of a note left at his door. Did you write it? Margaret had promised herself she would lie if needed. Instead, she heard herself say, Yes. Harland's pen stilled. He looked at her then, direct and assessing. Why did you not come sooner? I was not certain I ought. No, he said dryly. Few in this house are certain of what they ought lately. He closed the register. His Grace is not receiving tonight. You will remain available tomorrow morning. For what purpose? If His Grace chooses to ask it, he may tell you himself. She left on shaking legs and found Lady Kelly waiting in the corridor as if conjured. Well, Lady Kelly asked. He asked whether I wrote the note. I said yes. Lady Kelly's face did not change, which was worse than anger. And then, nothing else. I am to remain available. Available, Lady Kelly repeated. How fortunate for you. She stepped closer until Margaret could smell amber and cold cream. Listen to me very carefully. If you are summoned, you will speak only to the note and to concern for His Grace's health. You will not mention papers, signatures, cottages, mud, or gates. You will not mention my correspondence. If you do, I will see your father remembered as a careless thief before the month ends. Parish records are wonderfully pliable when gentlemen owe favours. My father was honest. Honesty is not a document, child. It is a story people agree to repeat. Lady Kelly smiled then, almost fondly. Do not force me to change the story. Morning came with a brittle brightness that made every silver edge in the breakfast room look sharp. By 10, His Grace had taken eggs. At 11, he had refused the physician again. By noon, he had sent 2 letters sealed with his private signet and asked for estate maps. The house interpreted this as recovery. Margaret interpreted it as preparation. She spent the hours between in the small office, copying harmless subscription lists over the dangerous pages she kept hidden beneath them. Jenkins brought in another bundle tied with blue ribbon and set it down without comment. From Lady Kelly, he said, for immediate fair copying. When he left, Margaret untied it and felt her stomach turn. Inside were draft notices to tenant families on Brackenmere East and South Mere, each regretfully announcing seizure for arrears under emergency authority. 2 were dated the same day the Duke had first locked his doors. 1 enclosed a schedule of parcels and estimated resale values that matched the phrase she had overheard. Distressed parcels, suitable to private acquisition. At the bottom of one draft, crossed out but still legible, was a line in a hand she knew too well. His Grace must sign unseen. Send after dinner when he is tired. Margaret stared at the ink until it blurred. Then she copied that too. By afternoon, Lady Kelly sent for her to the blue drawing-room, where sunlight struck crystal and made the whole chamber glitter like a threat. "You look pale," Lady Kelly said. "Are the numbers troubling you?" "No, ma'am." "Good. I require 12 invitation notes and 3 private letters, 1 to Mr. Brent and 1 to the vicar at St. Luke's." She held out a folded draft. "You will write precisely what is given." Margaret accepted the paper. The letter to the vicar began with condolences for the late Mr. Kelly's unfortunate final confusions in account. It went on to suggest modest corrections to memorial language in parish subscription records to avoid misunderstanding. For a second the room tilted. "Is there a difficulty?" Lady Kelly asked pleasantly. Margaret heard her own voice from far away. "No, ma'am." "Excellent. I should hate to think grief makes you inattentive." She turned to Louisa, who sat at the pianoforte picking out a waltz badly. "My dear, from the top again." "No, not like a funeral." Margaret carried the draft out with fingers gone numb. In the corridor she pressed the paper flat against the wall and read it once more. Not a threat now, a first move. If Lady Kelly posted that letter, the vicar would amend records, and amendments became fact for anyone who had not known Mr. Kelly in life. Debtor. Confused. Unreliable. It would not matter that it was false. It would be written. She went to the writing table, set out fresh sheets, and copied the invitations first, so no one could accuse her of delay. Then she copied the letter to Mr. Brent. Then, very carefully, she made a second copy of the letter to the vicar and slipped it between pages of her hidden ledger before addressing the original as ordered. At 6, Mr. Harland appeared in the doorway. "Miss Kelly!" She stood at once. "His Grace will see you," Harland said. "Now!" The corridor to the Duke's private rooms felt longer than any she had walked in Brackenmere House. 2 doors stood between the outer hall and the inner study. Both were unlocked now, though footmen remained posted as if memory required ceremony. Inside, the air smelled of coal and paper rather than sickness. The Duke stood at a table near the window, one hand braced on its edge. He was still too thin. His coat hung a little loose at the shoulder, but there was colour in his face and a dangerous steadiness in his gaze. On the table lay 3 ledgers, open. Margaret recognised them with a start, old estate books in her father's hand. "Miss Kelly," the Duke said, "close the door." She did. For a moment neither spoke. Then he touched the margin of one ledger, where a notation in brown ink read "Duplicate charge." Query authority in Mr. Kelly's compact script. "Your father annotated my accounts for 6 years," the Duke said. "He had an irritating habit of writing questions no one wished to answer." Margaret swallowed. "He believed questions were cheaper than lawsuits, Your Grace." A corner of the Duke's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "And dangerous to those who prefer theft." He picked up a folded scrap from the table and held it out. It was her note, crease-marked, the pencil line faint but legible. "Mr. Harland confirmed this is your hand." She folded her hands to keep them still. "Yes, Your Grace." "Why did you write it?" "Because I was hungry. Because you were dying 2 doors away, while everyone rehearsed condolences. Because no one else would risk offending you with the truth." Aloud she said, "Because dying would not mend what had been done." His eyes sharpened. "You know what was done then. Enough to know families were turned out under orders bearing your seal." He exhaled once. Controlled. "I signed documents 9 days ago after a 14-hour ride from Brackenmere in rain and no sleep. Brent had them waiting. Routine matters, he said. Tenancies, repairs, deferred rents." His jaw tightened. 3 days later, petitions arrived from East Holding and I found copies of eviction orders among the papers. My seal, my name. Margaret looked at the ledgers, at her father's old questions in the margins. "I believed I had condemned them through negligence," he said. "I believed the harm was mine, and that any defence would be cowardice. So I locked my door and declined food as penance." The word fell like a stone. Margaret heard distantly the rain beginning again against the shutters. When she spoke, her voice was low and very clear. "Your Grace, with respect, starving yourself was vanity in noble clothing." He went still. She forced herself on before fear could stop her. "It punished no one but the people already obliged to watch. It returned no child to a bed. It restored no tenancy. It left your enemies free to keep writing in your name." Silence held between them, taut as wire. Then the Duke let out a breath that might have been a laugh if laughter still lived in him. "No one has spoken to me like that in this house, possibly anywhere. Then no one has served you honestly." Something like approval flashed, quick and hard. He turned one ledger toward her. Beside her father's notes lay newer documents, clipped and sorted, orders, receipts, correspondence, all threaded by dates. On top sat a sheet in Lady Kelly's hand, copied from some draft and underlined twice. "His Grace must sign unseen." "I found this in a wastebasket burned at the edge," he said. "Harland rescued what he could. I also found your fair copies in the committee drawer with discrepancies marked in a cipher so clumsy a blind bishop could read it." Heat rose to Margaret's face. "I did not know whom to trust." "Wise," he straightened, wincing almost imperceptibly as if the effort cost him. "I trust very few myself at present. You may add your name to the short list." She stared at him. He said, "Quarter session sits in 12 days. Before then, I need every falsified order traced to source, seal, hand, witness, delivery. I need parish records checked against estate books. I need someone who can read both numbers and motives, and who is not already bought." He met her gaze fully now. "Will you help me build a case, Miss Kelly?" The question altered the room. Not command, not charity. A place offered at the table where decisions were made. Margaret thought of Lady Kelly's draft to the vicar, of men kneeling in mud at the estate gates, of one crust and one line laid outside a locked door. She thought of her father saying, "Look for what repeats." "Yes, Your Grace," she said. Then, because this answer was not the old obedience, she added, "On conditions." His brows rose. "My copies remain in my possession until duplicates are secured. Mr. Harland may inspect them, but they are not to pass through Lady Kelly's rooms or Mr. Brent's hands. And if my father's name is threatened, we answer publicly with original ledgers, not whispers." The Duke regarded her for a long beat, eyes hollowed still, but vividly awake. "At last," he said softly, "someone in this house negotiating with me instead of around me." He held out his hand. "Agreed." Margaret placed her ink-stained fingers in his. His grip was warm, steady despite the tremor of recovery, and brief as a contract. When she left the study, the corridor looked the same. Lamps, rugs, polished brass. But nothing in it was the same as before. Upstairs, a duke who had chosen to live had chosen finally to fight. Downstairs, Lady Kelly was still dangerous, still smiling, still writing letters that could unmake the dead. And between them now stood Margaret Kelly, no longer merely convenient, carrying evidence instead of trays. Margaret had gone no farther than the bend in the upper corridor when she heard silk move behind her like a warning. "Miss Kelly!" Lady Kelly stood near the stairhead, one gloved hand resting on the polished rail, her smile precise enough to cut paper. Louisa hovered half a pace behind her, bright-eyed and avid, as though waiting for a scene in a play she had paid well to watch. Margaret stopped. Lady Kelly! My daughter and I were concerned, her stepmother said. You were gone so long. His Grace keeps odd company these days. Louisa gave a soft laugh. He has always liked curiosities. Margaret kept her face still. His Grace requested account books. Did he? Lady Kelly's gaze flicked to Margaret's hands, empty now, then back to her face. And did you satisfy him? Yes. A beat passed. Rain tapped at the long windows. Below, somewhere near the breakfast room, a door shut sharply, and a servant hurried away. The whole house felt like a struck bell, still ringing from something no one would name aloud. Lady Kelly tilted her head. You look pale. Cook tells me you forget meals when you are overexcited. It would be a pity if weakness made you careless. Her voice softened, almost kind. Careless girls lose things. References, reputations, their father's good names, for instance. Louisa's smile widened. Margaret thought of the Duke's hand closing briefly over hers in agreement, and answered without lowering her eyes. Then I shall take care not to be careless. For one instant, Lady Kelly's mask slipped. Irritation, then calculation, then velvet again. Do. You are wanted in the blue drawing-room in 10 minutes. Mrs. Penrith has come from Hanover Square, and I require a quiet pair of hands with the correspondence. I have work for His Grace. And I have authority in this household, Lady Kelly replied, still smiling. Or have you forgotten? I forget very little, Margaret said. The two women stood in perfect civility, and in that civility declared war. 10 minutes later, Margaret stood in the blue drawing-room, sorted Mrs. Penrith's correspondence with a quiet hand, and left as soon as Lady Kelly dismissed her, without offering or receiving a private word. The next day by noon, the stakes had climbed high enough to make everyone breathless. His Grace appeared, thin, controlled, but unmistakably present, in the small morning room where the steward read the economy list. He spoke without lifting his voice, and no one missed a word. He asked for delivery books from Brackenmere East and South Mere, for seal logs, for messenger receipts, and for a list of every document bearing his signet in the last fortnight. Jenkins was instructed to place the boxes in the Duke's private study and to admit only Mr. Harland, Miss Kelly, and himself. The order ran through the house faster than fire. Servants who had spent 9 days carrying untouched trays now carried locked dispatch cases. Footmen who had learned not to ask questions began to ask them, silently with their eyebrows, their shoulders, the angle at which they held a door. In the kitchen passage, cook pressed a hunk of bread into Margaret's hand and muttered, "You'll need strength where gentlemen prefer swoons." Margaret ate while walking. At 3 she sat with Harland beyond the 2 locked doors of the inner study, where dust and ink and urgency made a different weather from the rest of Brackenmere House. Harland, neat as ruled paper, unfolded packets with a clerk's care and a conspirator's speed. "These are from the dispatch cabinet," he said, "and these from the committee drawer you marked." He allowed himself a brief glance up. "Your cipher was not as clumsy as His Grace pretends." Margaret almost smiled. It was clumsy enough to be read by the right eyes. Together they traced patterns. Eviction notices served before arrears dates existed, witness initials repeating in impossible combinations, 3 different signatures where the Duke should have made one, wax impressed with the Brackenmere crest but cooled on the wrong side, as if stamped from a lifted seal and not from the ring itself. In one bundle lay orders for immediate clearance of 2 cottages on Brackenmere East, identical wording, identical flourish, different pressure of pen. "Look at the downstroke," Margaret said, laying one page beside a true signature from 6 years prior. "His Grace drives through his B as though he means to split wood. This one only scratches the surface." Harland nodded grimly. Mr. Brent's office swore these were regular. Mr. Brent's office swore what it was paid to swear. At 6, Jenkins brought tea and shut the door behind him, with an emphasis that meant he had posted himself outside. He did not linger, but he did murmur, "Someone has been to the nursery attic, miss. Looked around, found nothing. I thought you'd wish to know." Margaret's fingers tightened around her cup. Her copies had already been moved. One set to a flour sack in the laundry passage, one to a false bottom in her workbox, one now in the Duke's safe. Only the attic packet held the full original draft in Lady Kelly's hand. The other sets were extracts and summaries. But the message was clear. Lady Kelly was searching. By evening, Brackenmere House had split cleanly down its centre. Above stairs, the Duke reasserted command one measured order at a time. Downstairs and in drawing rooms, Lady Kelly moved with jewelled serenity, sending 12 invitation notes and 3 private letters by special messenger, laughing too easily, touching arms she never touched unless she needed obedience bought cheap. Louisa watched Margaret with theatrical pity and whispered to anyone listening that desperation made plain girls bold. At 8, when Margaret returned to the inner study for review, the Duke stood by the fire, one hand braced on the mantel, as if steadying himself against a private wave of weakness. He looked up as she entered. "You should be asleep," she said, before she could stop herself. "And you should not command your employer," he returned. But there was the faintest edge of amusement under fatigue. "Report." She did, the forged pressures, the duplicated witness initials, the delivery times that placed one messenger in 2 places at once. Harland added that 1 key registry book from the estate office had gone missing entirely between morning and afternoon. "Who had access?" the Duke asked. Harland's mouth tightened. "Any with committee authority, Lady Kelly among them." The Duke was silent a moment. Rain struck harder at the shutters. "Then we proceed as if she has read our hand and intends to play before us." He looked at Margaret. "How much more can we prove in 10 days?" She met his gaze. "Enough, if we stop assuming paper alone will save us. We need witnesses who carried, served, sealed, and were told to keep quiet." "Servants will fear dismissal. Then ask them under your name, not hers. In writing, promise protection. Keep it." His jaw flexed. "Done." He straightened from the mantel. The effort cost him. She could see it in the small tremor at his wrist. But his voice held. "Miss Kelly, from this hour you work under my direct instruction. If anyone disputes your access, send for me." "Lady Kelly will call that impropriety." "Lady Kelly may call the moon green cheese if it pleases her. I am tired of arranging truth to preserve her comfort." Something in Margaret eased, though fear remained. The stakes were no longer whether she could keep her position. They were whether law would side with evidence before money buried it. And somewhere in the house, Lady Kelly was already writing the next move. The next obstacle arrived before breakfast. Margaret woke in the nursery attic to find her lock scratched and her trunk shifted half an inch from where she had wedged it beneath the sloped beam. Nothing seemed missing, at first. Then she lifted the false board and found 1 packet gone, her earliest copies, including the draft in Lady Kelly's hand, instructing that His Grace must sign unseen. She sat back on her heels, cold despite the stale warmth of the little room. Not stolen blindly, then. Targeted. By 9 she was in the study, telling the Duke and Harland with a steadier voice than she felt. Harland swore under his breath. The Duke's expression went very still. "Who knew where you kept that set?" he asked. "No one, unless someone saw me move it from the committee drawer the first day." "Or searched until they found your pattern," Harland said. Margaret forced herself to think like her father had taught her, not what frightened, what repeated. She took the one page that ties instruction to intent. She will destroy it, or worse, copy it, and claim I forged both. The Duke nodded once. Then we replace proof with redundancy. Harland extract statements immediately from those who saw Lady Kelly handle drafts. Verbal first, written once, witnessed. Servants may refuse. They may not, if I ask, and Jenkins stands the door. By 11, new trouble. A note from St. Luke's, folded with clerical neatness but reeking of panic. The vicar regretted he could not release parish memoranda concerning Mr. Kelly's final accounts, because a lady of the family had already requested corrections to confused entries, and legal counsel advised discretion until quarter sessions. Lady Kelly had moved on Margaret's father exactly as threatened. Margaret read the line twice and felt a pulse of rage so clean it clarified everything. She means to poison his name before we stand in court. The Duke took the letter from her. Then we go ourselves, today. Harland hesitated. Your Grace, if you appear publicly before you are stronger, let them see me alive, he said. Rumour has had enough of my absence. They went in a closed carriage through wet London streets, Jenkins opposite like a carved sentinel, and Margaret beside a dispatch case chained to her wrist beneath her sleeve. Every jolt seemed to travel through the Duke's too thin frame. Once, as they turned near Hanover Square, he closed his eyes and pressed 2 fingers hard to the bridge of his nose, mastering a wave of dizziness before anyone could pretend not to notice. At St. Luke's, the vicar received them in a cramped room that smelled of damp stone and old paper. He was polite and frightened in equal measure. Your Grace, he said, bowing. Miss Kelly, I am in an awkward position. You are in possession of records, Margaret said. Not a position, records. The vicar flinched but brought out the ledger. In the margin beside Mr. Kelly's name, a fresh annotation appeared in different ink. Irregular figures under review. Liabilities disputed. The handwriting was not the vicar's. Who wrote this? Margaret asked. He looked stricken. A clerk from Mr. Brent's office arrived with a letter bearing Lady Kelly's seal and said the correction was temporary, merely to prevent confusion. Temporary lies are still lies, she said. The Duke's voice was quiet, hard. You will provide sworn statement that this was inserted after Mr. Kelly's death and not by your hand. The vicar swallowed. If I do that, I make enemies. If you do not, the Duke replied, you make yourself accessory. By the time they returned to Brackenmere House, rain had given way to a thin, brittle sun, and the house itself seemed to have grown eyes. Louisa met them in the hall wearing innocence like a ribbon. Mamma has had callers all afternoon, she chirped. Such concern for His Grace's health. One hears such alarming stories when gentlemen refuse physicians. Margaret brushed past her. In the study another blow waited. Mr. Silas Brent had filed notice that any documents removed without committee authorization were improperly obtained and could be challenged as inadmissible. In plain language, he meant to paint Margaret a thief and the Duke a compromised invalid. Harland laid the notice down carefully. He means to strike us before we enter the room. The Duke gave a humourless smile. Then we enter with witnesses, not only papers. That evening he ordered sworn declarations from Jenkins, cook, and 2 footmen regarding tray deliveries, sealed packets, and Lady Kelly's instructions during the 9 days of seclusion. 1 footman cried while signing, certain he would be ruined. The Duke signed beneath him and said, If ruin comes, it comes to me first. Margaret watched that, and something tightened and softened at once in her chest. Near midnight, as she crossed the laundry passage to hide another duplicate, A hand caught her elbow in the dark. She jerked free, heart hammering, and found not an attacker but the stepmother's dresser, pale and trembling. "I should not speak," the woman whispered, "but I heard Madame tell Mr. Brent this. If Miss Kelly cannot be discredited, she must be made impossible. They mean to say you are unstable from hunger, prone to fantasies, and jealous of your sister's prospects. They mean to suggest you pursued his grace to his door at night." Margaret went very still. "Why tell me?" The dresser looked away. "Because your father once found my brother work when no one would. Because dead men deserve better than this." She vanished before Margaret could answer. By morning the complication had become a noose. The legal case depended on evidence, and the social case depended on whether anyone believed the woman presenting it. Lady Kelly had arranged to attack both. The crisis broke 2 nights before quarter sessions. A fog rolled in from the river and lay over London like wool. Lamps burned halos instead of light. In that muffled dark, Brackenmere House felt less like a home than a besieged fort. Margaret and Harland worked at the long table, while the Duke dictated a chronology. 14-hour ride, papers presented at exhaustion, signatures obtained unseen, petitions arriving 3 days later, seclusion, refusal of physicians, discovery of discrepancies, recovery, inquiry. Every point matched to document, every document to witness. They had built, if not a fortress, at least a bridge sturdy enough to carry truth across a hostile room. Then Jenkins entered without knocking, face set in lines Margaret had never seen. "Your Grace," he said, "there has been an incident at the East Holding. 2 families received fresh removal notices this afternoon, stamped and sealed. Men sent to clear by dawn." The Duke went white under the candlelight. "I signed no such order." "I know it, sir." Margaret held out her hand. "Show me." Jenkins gave her the notice. The wording was harsher than before, almost triumphant. "Final enforcement." At the bottom sprawled the Duke's name in a hand that copied form and missed force, and beneath it a witness initialed L.K. "She's accelerating," Margaret said. "If they are turned out now, Brent will argue at sessions the matter is completed fact. Harder to reverse." The Duke was already reaching for his coat. "Carriage." Harland stepped in front of him. "At this hour, in this condition, if you collapse at the gates—" "Then I collapse at my gates!" the Duke snapped. The anger burned bright enough to hide exhaustion for 1 dangerous second. "I will not sit by the fire while they put children in the road to strengthen a legal argument." Margaret rose. "You won't go alone?" His eyes cut to her. "No." He meant refusal. She meant certainty. "Your Grace," she said, forcing calm into urgency, "if you ride out and fail, Brent calls it hysteria. If you stay and send only men, Lady Kelly calls it rumour. If we go together, with Jenkins, with the original seal log, with counter-orders signed in view of witnesses, we create record in real time. That survives argument." A long beat. Then he nodded. "Done." As they gathered papers, hooves struck hard in the front court. Jenkins, listening at the service door, muttered that Lady Kelly had just sent a rider toward Brent's chambers. They left by the service entrance to avoid the drawing rooms, where laughter floated too brightly behind closed doors. Lady Kelly entertaining, perhaps, while the East tenants packed in terror. Fog swallowed the carriage lamps before they reached the square. At the estate gates they found exactly what Margaret had feared. 2 carts loaded with bedding, 1 child asleep against a rolled quilt, a man standing in mud with hat crushed in both hands. Beside him a bailiff held the forged order and looked bored. When he saw the Duke step down, the bailiff blanched. "Read the seal log," the Duke said to Harland, voice carrying in the wet night. Harland read entries aloud by date and hour. No clearance order had been issued that day. Jenkins produced the master ring. Margaret unfolded the forged notice and held it beside a valid one under lantern light for all to see. "Observe the wax," she said, loud enough for tenants and bailiffs alike. "Crest misaligned. Cooling ridge on the wrong edge. This was lifted and pressed, not struck, by hand, at sign." The man with the crushed hat stared. "Then we're not put out." "You are not," the Duke said. "Not tonight, not by fraud." He signed immediate suspension of all removals pending quarter sessions. In front of 5 witnesses and a parish constable Jenkins had wisely fetched on the way. Margaret watched each signature land like a nail sealing a crate against theft. For one breathless moment she thought they had pulled clear. Then a second carriage arrived, lacquered dark, crest discreet but known. Mr. Silas Brent stepped down, wrapped in legal confidence and rain. "Your Grace," he said with a shallow bow, "I advise caution. Interfering with process may expose you to further embarrassment in open court." The Duke's mouth went flat. "You mistake me for a man still hiding in his rooms." Brent's eyes slid to Margaret. "Miss Kelly appears everywhere important these days. A devoted relation, or an ambitious one." Margaret met his gaze. "A literate one. You should try it." His smile thinned. "Wit is no substitute for legitimacy. At sessions, Madame will present testimony regarding your emotional instability and history of grievance. These theatrical excursions will only support her concern." There it was, spoken plain in the fog, ruin her before she opened her mouth. The Duke took one step forward. Jenkins tensed, ready if needed. But His Grace only said very clearly, "At sessions I will present Miss Kelly as my witness and adviser. Any attack on her character will be answered under oath by me." Brent's expression flickered. Surprise, then calculation. He bowed again, lower this time, and returned to his carriage. On the ride back, silence filled the compartment. The Duke sat opposite Margaret, hat in his lap, breathing carefully as if each breath required instruction. In the moving lamplight his face looked older, drawn not by years but by the cost of choosing to stand up in public where others preferred him absent. At last he said, "He will not stop at slander." "No," Margaret answered, "nor will she." "Then we end it in one blow." By the time Brackenmere House came into view, dawn had begun to thin the fog. In the breakfast room, maps and ledgers waited where they had left them, along with fresh ink and a stack of clean foolscap. They worked through the grey morning, ordering exhibits, indexing dates, marking where each witness entered and where each lie could be pinned to paper. At 8, Jenkins brought coffee and word that Lady Kelly had announced she would attend quarter sessions in full health and spirits. "She says she hopes to spare His Grace distressing scenes." The Duke gave a short laugh with no mirth in it. "How charitable!" At 10, Margaret received a folded note delivered without signature. Inside, in Louisa's looping hand, were 7 words. "Plain girls should not gamble above station." Margaret fed it to the fire. By afternoon, the final packet was sealed. Parallel ledgers, duplicated correspondence, parish notation proof, suspension orders from the East Gates, sworn statements from servants and vicar, and the rescued draft line that had nearly been lost, His Grace must sign unseen, reconstructed from 2 partial copies, and Harland's testimony. When the last wax cooled, the Duke looked at Margaret across the table. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she echoed. Outside, carriage wheels began to gather in the street as callers arrived for Lady Kelly's evening salon, hungry for scandal and reassurance that rank still meant impunity. Upstairs, in the study beyond 2 locked doors, a different company prepared. A duke still thin, a secretary exact, a servant loyal, and a woman long dismissed as convenient, now holding enough truth to threaten everyone who had counted on her silence. By nightfall the house had chosen its sides, though only one side understood the price, and when Margaret finally went to her narrow bed in the nursery attic, she did not sleep. She lay listening to the old beams creak and the distant murmur of voices below, one hand resting on the dispatch case key at her throat, and rehearsed not fear, but sequence, date, signature, witness, motive, harm. In the morning they would go where whispers ended and records spoke. Morning came colourless and thin, as if London itself mistrusted what the day would bring. Margaret dressed in the nursery attic by touch more than sight, fingers finding hooks and laces through the dim. She pinned her hair plain, as always. At her throat, under her collar, the key to the dispatch case lay cool against her skin. She stood one moment before the narrow mirror, seeing not beauty nor plainness, only a woman who had spent years being arranged by other people and had, at last, arranged herself. Downstairs, Brackenmere House wore its split loyalties like mismatched gloves. In the servants' hall, cook pressed a parcel of bread and cold beef into Margaret's hand with muttered insistence. Jenkins checked the carriage list twice and said nothing unnecessary. In the blue drawing-room, where Lady Kelly had held her salon the previous evening, two maids were clearing glasses and rose petals, as if scandal could be swept up with wax drippings. By 8, Margaret, His Grace, Mr. Harland and Jenkins were on the road to quarter sessions. No one spoke much in the carriage. Harland reviewed the index cards under his breath. Jenkins held the dispatch case on his knees as if it contained explosives, which, in a social sense, it did. Across from Margaret, the Duke stared out the window at streets slick with old rain, his profile severe in the grey light. He looked stronger than he had a week ago, less spectre, more man, but the strain showed in the set of his mouth and the careful stillness of his hands. At one sharp corner the carriage jolted. A tremor crossed his right wrist before he stilled it. Margaret looked away to grant him privacy and found in the reflection of the glass that he had seen her do it. When they arrived, the square outside the hall was already crowded. Estate men in work coats, local stewards. 2 parish women Margaret recognised from the east gate, shawls clutched tight, faces wary. Curious onlookers who smelled ruin and had come to watch rank bleed. Inside, the hearing chamber was high-ceilinged, draughty, and too bright near the windows. At the centre stood the magistrate's table. Below it, rows of benches and the long side tables where papers became weapons. Brent was already there, immaculate in dark cloth, expression composed. Beside him sat Lady Kelly in deep plum silk and restrained jewels, a study in injured dignity. Louisa, pale and over-adorned, kept her chin high and her eyes moving quickly, like someone at a card table pretending she had not already lost. Lady Kelly's gaze found Margaret at once. It held no surprise, only a kind of glittering satisfaction, as if she still believed the room itself would do her work for her. The clerk called the matter. Voices hushed. The magistrate, a broad-faced man with tired eyes and no patience for theatrics before tea, opened the proceedings. Concerning removals executed and attempted on Brackenmere East and South Mere Holdings. Questions of validity of orders, authority and alleged fraud. Let us be plain and quick if possible. Brent rose first, smooth as oil. He spoke of confusion during His Grace's recent indisposition, of administrative burden, of regrettable misunderstandings inflamed by household tensions. He submitted a stack of apparently regular orders and suggested that certain emotional parties had misconstrued routine enforcement as conspiracy. His tone was careful, respectful to rank, pitying toward women, contemptuous toward fact. Then Lady Kelly stood, hand to breast, and gave the room sorrow. She spoke of her devotion to family stability, of her fear during the Duke's illness, of Miss Kelly, my poor late husband's daughter, whom I have sheltered as my own, becoming overtired, underfed, prone to dramatic conclusions. "She is not wicked," Lady Kelly said, voice trembling on command, "merely impressionable, and recently encouraged in notions above her station." A murmur passed through the benches. Margaret felt heat rise at her collar. She pressed 2 fingers to the edge of the table until it passed. Brent resumed, now with teeth hidden inside courtesy. He raised questions of admissibility, copied documents, private papers, unclear chain of custody. He noted Margaret's proximity to his Grace and hinted that ambition might colour testimony. He mentioned, almost lazily, rumours of instability, and therefore, he concluded, while my clients sympathise with youthful zeal, we submit that no criminal inference should be drawn from clerical inconsistency amidst domestic distress. He sat. The magistrate turned to the Duke. "Your Grace?" His Grace rose slowly. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled. "I was exhausted when certain papers were put before me after a 14-hour ride. Petitions regarding resulting harm reached me 3 days later. I then did what I should not have done. I withdrew. During that failure, fraud multiplied in my name. I am here to end it." He nodded once to Harland. Harland stood, but Margaret rose before he could begin. "Sir," she said to the magistrate, clear enough to cut through the chamber, "with permission, I would present sequence before interpretation, date, document, witness, and consequence." Brent half rose. "Miss Kelly has not been called?" The magistrate lifted a hand. "She has now. Proceed, Miss Kelly." Margaret stepped to the centre table with the dispatch case. Jenkins brought it forward and laid out the first bundle. Wax seals cracked, papers fanned. The chamber leaned in. She did exactly what she had rehearsed in the attic through sleepless dark. First, the valid seal log, with entries by date and hour. Second, the disputed orders, including those served at East holding 2 nights prior. Third, side-by-side comparisons under light, genuine and forged signatures, similar form, different pen pressure. Fourth, wax analysis, crest alignment, cooling ridge direction. This ridge, as at East Gate, falls opposite the handset press used in Brackenmere offices. It indicates transfer, not strike. Fifth, witness initials impossible on their own terms. JS and RB recorded at 2 separate locations at the same hour, as shown by parish collection ledger and stable log. Sixth, debt schedules tied to distressed parcels suitable to private acquisition. Seventh, the reconstructed draft line from 2 partial copies and Harland's sworn recollection. His Grace must sign unseen, each point anchored to paper, each paper to a name. When Brent objected, she answered with dates. When he suggested fabrication, she produced matching ink inventories and copy timestamps from the office register. When he questioned motive, she laid down Lady Kelly's private letter to the vicar at St. Luke's requesting notation against the late Mr. Kelly's record, irregular figures under review, liabilities disputed, dated after Margaret began copying evidence. The chamber shifted from curiosity to attention so tight it felt like pressure in the ears. Brent stood for cross-examination, smile gone. "Miss Kelly," he began, "you admit you were hungry and sleep-deprived during this period?" "Yes." "You admit emotional strain?" "Yes." "You admit personal resentment toward Lady Kelly?" "I admit pattern recognition." A snort of laughter escaped someone on the back bench and was immediately smothered. Brent's jaw ticked. "You are not legally trained." "No. You are, however, deeply involved with His Grace's private affairs." I am involved with his public records. You expect this court to accept that a young woman with no fortune, no office, and no formal standing uncovered what experienced men missed? Margaret met his gaze. Experienced men did not miss it. Experienced men drafted it. A sharper murmur now. Even the clerk looked up. Brent pivoted to poison. Is it not true, Miss Kelly, that during His Grace's recent vulnerability you sought unusual access to his chambers? The room chilled. Margaret answered before the insult could land in her body. I carried trays because I was ordered. On the 9th night I left bread and a note urging him to live. If that is unusual, the fault is not mine. Lady Kelly rose abruptly, silk whispering like drawn steel. Enough of this performance. She has always been theatrical in private. Sit down, madam, said the magistrate. Lady Kelly did not. Her mask cracked at the edges. This girl is illegitimate in spirit, if not in blood. She feeds on grievance. She would drag us all through filth for the pleasure of being seen. Ask her what she wants. Ask her what bargain she has made upstairs with a grieving man. The words struck the chamber like thrown glass. Before Margaret could speak, the Duke stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Miss Kelly stands here at my request as my witness and adviser. Any attack upon her character is an attack upon my sworn evidence. I state under oath that she has acted with integrity where others acted with theft. I further state that her late father's records are cleaner than those of any man currently profiting from this disorder. He turned slightly, enough to include Lady Kelly and Brent both. You relied on my silence. You will now answer to my speech. The magistrate rapped hard for order, though the room had already fallen still. After a brief consultation with the clerk and 2 assessors, he delivered rulings in clipped, practical terms. Immediate nullification of disputed removal orders, restoration pending review for households displaced under contested authority, seizure of relevant estate correspondence, referral for criminal inquiry into forgery, coercion, and fraudulent conveyance, and provisional censure of Mr. Silas Brent pending full legal examination. Lady Kelly made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a laugh. Louisa stared at her mother as if seeing her without cosmetics for the first time. When officers stepped forward, Lady Kelly drew herself up to full height. You cannot possibly mean to treat me as common. As accountable, said the magistrate. She looked once at Margaret, hatred now stripped of elegance. Then she gathered her skirts and walked out between 2 officials in silence so absolute it rang. Brent followed under escort, still arguing procedure to anyone who would listen. Only when the doors closed did air seem to return to the room. Benches creaked. Pens resumed scratching. Somewhere behind Margaret, one of the parish women began to cry softly in relief. Margaret sat down because her knees had become unreliable without permission. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. The Duke leaned toward her, close enough that only she heard. You did not tremble once. I trembled continuously, she whispered back. I merely kept it internal. For the first time that day, his mouth softened into something almost like a smile. The days that followed did not move like triumph. They moved like work. Orders had to be untangled, locks reopened, names restored to tenancy rolls, carts sent not to clear homes but to return bedsteads and trunks that had been stacked in outbuildings, pending lawful disposal. At Brackenmere East, Margaret stood with Jenkins, while Harland read the reinstatement notices aloud to gathered families, each clause plain enough to hold in memory. Men who had knelt in mud now stood with shoulders square. Women asked practical questions about seed credit and roof repairs. Children watched the Duke from behind skirts, uncertain what to make of a lord who apologised out loud. At Southmere, 2 cottages had taken water while empty. The Duke ordered immediate repairs and waived winter arrears without ceremony. "No speeches," he told Harland. "Only receipts." Criminal inquiry widened quickly. The seal-copying apparatus was found in a clerk's rented room linked to Brent's office. Payments traced outward to intermediaries and inward to accounts Lady Kelly controlled through a charitable subcommittee that had never distributed charity. Statements from servants at Brackenmere House, 5 in all, as Jenkins had predicted, corroborated document movements and late-night instructions. The vicar at St. Luke's produced Lady Kelly's letter requesting defamatory alteration to Mr. Kelly's parish notation, and, red with indignation, supplied a sworn declaration that he had formally refused. He further attested that Brent's clerk altered the ledger anyway during temporary access obtained by deception. Within weeks, Mr. Silas Brent was suspended from practice. By season's turn, he was formally disbarred. Society called it a regrettable professional collapse, as if ethics were weather, but no one entrusted him with land again. Lady Kelly withdrew to Bath before she could be formally compelled to remain in London for social scrutiny. She did not go in disgrace publicly, women of her sort rarely did, but under a cloud thick enough that invitations thinned to none. Louisa went with her, tearful and brittle, leaving behind trunks of gowns and a note to Margaret that began with accusation, and ended, surprisingly, with one honest line: "I never learned how to be anything but her daughter." Margaret kept the note for a week, then burned it. As for Mr. Kelly's name, that thread was settled on a rain-bright afternoon in the Brackenmere breakfast-room. The Duke had invited the estate committee, 2 magistrates, the vicar, and several tenant representatives to review the reconstruction accounts. At the close, before anyone could rise, he said, "There is one debt of acknowledgement overdue. These corrected ledgers rely in method and margin upon principles taught in this house years ago by Mr. Kelly, whose integrity has been slandered for convenience. Let the record show I place full confidence in his books and in the daughter he trained." No one mistook the statement for sentiment. It was an entry in public memory, written in rank and heard by those who repeated things correctly when it benefited them. By evening, the line had travelled farther than gossip ever had. That night, Margaret went to the attic, opened the box where she kept her father's penknife and old letters, and cried, for the first time since the hearing, quietly, with relief sharp as pain. He asked her to marry him in the private study beyond 2 locked doors, on a day so ordinary it felt almost deliberate. No storm, no ball, no witnesses. Just late light on shelves, ink drying on routine estate correspondence, and the faint smell of bread from the kitchen passage below. The Duke stood by the desk, one hand resting on the blotter where her copies still lay in neat stacks. He had regained weight enough that his coat fit properly again. Colour had returned to his face. The old severity remained, but now it moved with warmth instead of ice. "Margaret," he said, and then stopped, as if choosing language in which rank could not hide. "I am a man improved by your contradiction. I do not wish to govern this house or any future years without you. Will you marry me?" She loved him already. That was the clean, terrible truth. She also remembered hunger on the servants' stair, threats in the dressing-room, and how swiftly dependence becomes a collar. So she said, "No, not yet." He did not flinch. "Tell me." "If I marry now, I enter your life as gratitude. I will be told by half of London and perhaps by myself in weak hours that I was rescued and paid in title. I cannot bear that shape. I have lived too long as someone else's convenience." She took a breath. "I will stand beside you, but not as a dependent transfigured, as an equal withstanding of her own. The silence that followed was thoughtful, not wounded. At minimum, she continued steadier now, I require an independent settlement in my own name, not revocable by mood or marriage. I require authority to continue work on estate records and tenant schooling. And I require a schoolroom funded in my father's name, with proper master and mistress, open to tenant children year-round, not as charity season ornament. His expression changed then, not to anger, but to something like fierce respect. Is that all? He asked softly. For now. He inclined his head. Done, she blinked. Done. Done. Drafts will be prepared by Harland tomorrow, reviewed by your own solicitor, not mine. Endowments secured before any announcement. And the schoolroom, no, a full schoolhouse, begins with spring works. She had expected negotiation. She had not expected immediate assent. You had considered this, she said. I hoped for this, he corrected. If you had answered yes at once, I would have wondered whether you were unwell. She laughed then, startled into it, and the sound seemed to alter the room. It took 3 months to settle everything properly. True to his word, he insisted on independent legal counsel for her. The settlement was substantial and entirely hers. The schoolhouse plans were drawn, revised with tenant input, and approved with Mr. Kelly's name carved above the future lintel. Kelly School for Accounts and Letters. Wages for teachers were fixed in trust, so no future duchess could economise children into illiteracy. Only when all instruments were signed, sealed, and lodged did he ask again. They were walking the east boundary where new hedge had been laid, and repaired cottages stood smoke-warm in evening cold. Margaret Kelly, he said, hat in hand now despite wind and mud, will you marry me? She looked at the fields that had nearly been lost, at the households lit from within, at the man beside her who had learned to choose life in public. Yes, she said. Their wedding was modest by ducal standards and extravagant only in sincerity. It took place in the small chapel near Brackenmere rather than in London glare. No crush of titled spectators, no strategic guest list engineered for alliance. Jenkins stood near the front in a coat he pretended not to have brushed twice. Cook cried openly and blamed onions not present. Harland, solemn as statute, held the ring case as if delivering evidence. The vicar from St. Luke's came by special invitation and smiled through the vows. Louisa did not attend. Lady Kelly sent no message. Margaret wore cream wool trimmed simply, her dark hair unadorned except for her mother's old comb. The Duke wore his title like a coat he had finally learned to carry rather than wield. When they spoke the vows, neither stumbled. Afterward, there was bread, cheese, hot pies, and cider in the long hall, with tenants and staff eating in overlapping clusters that would once have scandalised Brackenmere protocol. At Margaret's request, the first toast was not to rank, but to records kept honestly. The second, from Jenkins, was to doors that open before someone must starve to prove a point. In the first year of marriage they argued often and productively, over drainage contracts, over library budgets, over whether a duke could reasonably be expected to eat luncheon when engrossed in ledgers. They also laughed more than either had thought possible in houses once built for silence. The schoolhouse opened in autumn. Children arrived with slate boards and muddy boots. Margaret taught sums 2 mornings a week when estate duties allowed. The Duke took reading on winter afternoons and was discovered, to general delight, incapable of voices for storybook foxes. Mr. Kelly's name over the door weathered from sharp-cut white to warm stone grey, visible from the lane. As seasons turned, one private ritual endured. Whenever grief, guilt, or old habits tempted the Duke toward withdrawal, when a tenant death reopened old shame, when Parliament threatened bad harvest levies, when anniversaries sharpened memory, Margaret would leave a heel of coarse bread wrapped in linen just outside his study door. No note now. Unless needed. He never ignored it. Sometimes he opened at once and drew her in. Sometimes, after an hour, he came out carrying the empty cloth, eyes clearer. Brackenmere House changed in ways no ledger fully captured. Fewer locked doors, more voices in corridors, meals taken at table, not as tokens left untouched in hallways. Grief still visited, as it does everywhere, but it was no longer enthroned in solitude. Years later, when people asked how the Duchess had first caught His Grace's attention, society supplied embroidery, a sonnet, a dramatic feint, a moonlit confession. The household, wiser and less romantic, told the plain version. He had refused to eat for 9 days. She had left bread outside his door, and because she believed living men could still atone, both of them had learned to build a life in which truth was kept, names were defended, and love looked less like rescue than like two stubborn consciences, choosing, daily, to remain open.